I want to make it very clear that Microsoft of the 90s and early 2000s acted very aggressively towards Linux. It was shown clearly in the Halloween documents that they were fearful of servers adopting Linux and just as fearful of it happening on the desktop. And they allegedly funded research from the Gartner Group completely slamming Linux, saying that Linux would be dead with Windows 2000 Service Pack 1, which clearly went very well, and allegedly funded the SEO Group lawsuit against Red Hat and ex-SEO Group customers who had now migrated over to Linux. And that's just scratching the surface of what Microsoft did during that period. I could do a whole video about Microsoft not wanting PCs to be sold unless they had a Windows key included. But Steve Ballmer running Microsoft did do something really good for Linux. Because a lot of people hated him so much and hated the way that he was running Microsoft, the people that supported Linux way more than they would have otherwise. So you've probably heard the Steve Ballmer quote from 2001, "Linux is a cancer." When this was first said, it was reported on by a bunch of outlets, it came up in a bunch of forums, it was reported on The Register. It had a story on Slashdot, Linux.com, ZDNet, and a bunch of others out there as well. And over the years, it has still been repeated and repeated, and you'll still see people bringing it up today. So much so that it's mentioned in at least 3 pages on Wikipedia. I say at least 3 because these are the ones I found after a quick search. This is Embrace, Extend, Extinguish. Microsoft has changed since the days of branding Linux a cancer. History of Linux. In the past, Microsoft had termed Linux a cancer and communist. That is a whole separate video I might have to talk about as well. And Microsoft and open source. Ballmer also likened Linux to a kind of cancer on intellectual properties. But have you ever considered that that's not actually the quote? He did say those words, but there's all this stuff surrounding it that in my opinion is just as, or maybe even more interesting, and sort of speaks volumes about Ballmer's views on open source, free software, and Linux at the time. This quote originally comes from an interview with the Chicago Sun-Times. The interviewer asks, "Do you view Linux and the open source movement as a threat to Microsoft?" I'm going to read the entire quote, and then we'll go back and break it all down. He says, "Yeah, it's good competition. It will force us to be innovative. It will force us to justify the prices and value that we deliver, and that's only healthy. The only thing we have a problem with is when the government funds open source work. Government funding should be for work that is available to everybody. Open source is not available to commercial companies. The way the license is written, if you use any open source software, you have to make the rest of your software open source. If the government wants to put something in the public domain, it should. Linux is not in the public domain. Linux is a cancer that attaches itself in an intellectual property sense to everything it touches. That's the way the license works. Now try and tell me that is not a far more interesting quote than boring old Linux is a cancer. From now on, I'll show each of the sections I'm talking about on the screen. So regarding the first point, with a company acting in good faith, I would totally believe that they're trying to offer a better product, they're trying to better justify their prices, trying to be innovative. That would all make sense. But remember, we are talking about Microsoft of the early 2000s. If the Halloween documents are to be believed, which a lot of people think they are, they acted through both the SEO Group with their lawsuits and the Gartner Group doing basically fake research. That had nothing to do with offering a better product, offering better prices, justifying their prices, or anything like that. That was trying to litigate Linux into destruction and blatantly lie about it. As for government funding, maybe a company with government contracts shouldn't be talking about how government funding is bad and how if you have government funding, the work you do should be in the public domain. Why should open source be special in this regard? Or more accurately, free software. But Ballmer does not want to use the term free software because just using the term would give some level of credibility to the movement. If Microsoft wants things that are government funded to be in the public domain, well, go ahead, Stop charging for things, just release everything. Everything you do should be free because you have government funding, therefore, public domain. Now, obviously, this is ridiculous, and nobody actually holds this stance. This was just trying to come up with reasons for why the free software movement is bad and what Microsoft does is good. On that point about free software and open source, you can see in a way, Ballmer is really smart about how he talks about this. Never mentioning free software, not even a slight reference to what it is, the free software movement, RMS, or anything like that, only using the term open source. Nowadays, there is a lot more mixing between the two movements, but back then, it was a very clear separation. But in another way, it kind of makes him look like a complete idiot, because he describes the open source movement as the free software movement, which makes it seem like he's completely out of touch and doesn't know what's going on. But I'm almost certain, that Ballmer is not dumb. He is fully aware that the separation exists. He is fully aware that free software is more than just copyleft. He is fully aware that licenses like MIT, the BSD style licenses, are not copyleft and would be fully compatible with what they're trying to do at Microsoft. The MIT license had been around since the 80s. There is no way that Ballmer wasn't aware of it. But for the sake of his argument and making it make any level of sense, everything has to act like the GPL. Otherwise, why isn't Microsoft getting involved in this space? If he acknowledges that other things exist, the entire thing falls apart. The next one goes back to that government funding point. When Windows or Microsoft Office is available in the public domain, when it is free of charge, then we can have an argument about everything needing to be public domain. Until then, yeah, let's not talk about that. And the final section is where the famous quote lives. Linux is a cancer. And this entire section here is a very subtle reference to the free software movement, GPL, and copyleft, because what he's saying is that Linux uses a copyleft license. He's describing it as a cancer on intellectual property, meaning it is a viral license. Viral license is sort of a pejorative term that people will use for describing copyleft and the GPL. The idea from people who don't like copyleft and the GPL is that if you bring some copyleft code into your codebase, that codebase is now infected, and the rest of the codebase is going to need to be under some sort of compatible license. This isn't exactly correct. There are clear established ways nowadays of doing separation so that you can use GPL components without it affecting the rest of your codebase. There are a lot of projects out there that make use of these GPL libraries, GPL tools, and don't have the entire thing being under a GPL style license. I think it's fair to have a discussion about whether viral license is a valid descriptor of what copyleft and the GPL does, but I personally don't really care about it, because whether it's insulting or not doesn't really change what the license actually does. If someone doesn't want to use the license, they weren't going to use it anyway. It doesn't matter if it's viral or copyleft, the effect is exactly the same. Now, we all know about Satya Nadella, the CEO that took over after Ballmer, who in 2014 stood in front of a slide saying, "Microsoft loves Linux." Well, following this 2 years later, Ballmer actually did half apologize for what he said in 2001. The threat from Linux is in the rear view mirror. Also, the company made a ton of money by fighting that battle very well. It's been incredibly important to the company's revenue stream. Which is not really an apology in any real sense, but they're just saying, maybe the problem with Linux is in the past, now let's move past that. The reason why this was made around that time is SQL Server for Linux was just being released. So, going back to that money point, they kind of want people to actually use it. And he also said he loved seeing this announcement. Which, doesn't mean that Linux is now great, it's just, hey, we found a way to monetize it, so monetizing it's great. So, I hope you learned something. If you see someone throwing the quote around, send them to this video. Maybe they'll learn something a bit more about it they didn't know before, and see there's a lot more context around it that, as I said earlier, I think is a lot more interesting. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section down below. If you like the video, go like the video. And if you really like the video and you want to become one of these amazing people over here, check out the Patreon, Scribes, the Liberapay, linked in the description down below. That's going to be it for me, and Ballmer bad.
Daytime better call the bet. Ain't playing at your best, then you will get left. If it don't involve money, then I don't accept. If it don't involve money, then I don't accept.